Let me just pick up on something that Kateri mentioned, and that is that I used to be on the Armed Services Committee. For me, energy efficiency and renewable energy is an environmental issue and a pocketbook issue and an economic issue, but first and foremost, it is a robust national security issue. And let me tell you specifically what I mean by that. I woke up this morning, you woke up this morning, if you turned on the news shows, there's a lot of information about a governor from Carolina, but there's also continued very deep concern about Iran. When I was on the Armed Services Committee, I was so concerned about Iran and what would happen if they weaponized enriched uranium that I asked the National Defense University if they would do a war game to simulate how we would respond to an announcement by Ahmadinejad that he had nuclear weapons and he was going to use them. And the National Defense University did that war game and invited members of Congress to participate in that war game. In fact, President Obama, as a new senator, participated in that war game with me and about 6 or 7 other members of Congress. And the simulation was Ahmadinejad stands up at a podium like this at a press conference and announces to the world that he has enriched uranium and he's prepared to deliver a nuclear weapon against Israel. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, most of the members of Congress and many of the senators, the people who don't have to really think through military operations, said, well, bomb them. Bomb them. We can't have Iran with nuclear weapons. Send in the F-16s. Send in the C-17s. Send in the Stryker combat vehicles. It was the generals and the admirals who shook their heads in doubt. Why? Because Iran is sitting on the second largest recoverable reserve of oil in the Persian Gulf. Because it is the 4th largest exporter of crude oil in the world. Because it controls the Straits of Hormuz. 90% of all Persian Gulf oil flows through the Straits of Hormuz. What does that have to do with our military capabilities? Here's what. The F-16 that we would send over burns 27 gallons of fuel a minute when its afterburners are lit. The C-17 that we would send over burns 3,000 gallons of fuel an hour. The Stryker combat vehicles that we would send over, the ones that you see on the news in Iran in Iraq, not Iran yet, we haven't gone in yet, Iraq and Afghanistan, they get about 5 miles to the gallon. 2 years ago in Iraq, we received a dispatch from a general named General Zimmer pleading with Congress to send him solar panels. Why? His convoy lines were so long, soldiers were getting shot at trying to bring fuel into his operating base. Meanwhile, he said, I'm sitting in the middle of the desert. Can I get a solar panel? Won't that help? And so for me, energy was and has been first and foremost a national security issue. Now, let me give you the problem, and let me give you the solution, and be true to my 5-minute, maybe 6. I'm in Congress, you know. It's problem is I could have given you this speech 30 years ago. 30 years ago, Jimmy Carter wrapped himself in a cardigan sweater and declared the moral equivalent of war against our dependence on foreign oil. And you know what we've done in the 30 years since then? We have doubled our imports of oil from the Middle East, and we have slashed investments in energy, federal investments, in energy efficiency, research and development by 85%. There's a correlation between those two things. One of my, how many of you actually work on the Hill? Raise your hand if anybody work on the Hill? Okay, so do you all remember a congressman elected in 2000 when I was elected named Tom Osborne, congressman from Nebraska? Tom was one of the most conservative members of the House. He was so conservative that he's really actually progressive. I mean, he was so far to the right that he was turning to the left. And he and I were great friends. He's no longer in Congress. He ran for governor of Nebraska. Lost, left Congress. And one day we were walking to work, and we were talking not about energy, we were talking about another area of U.S. policy. And he said something that was so wonderful. I said, Tom, I'm going to steal it from you. I'm going to apply it to energy efficiency and renewable energy, but I'll give you credit. Now, Tom is not only a member of Congress, but he was famous for something else. Anybody know what Tom Osborne was famous for? Football coach. Legendary football coach at the University of Nebraska. Legendary. I mean, if there was water in Nebraska, Tom Osborne's constituents would believe he could walk back and forth on top of it. and so this is what Tom was saying. He said, you know, Steve, he goes, I probably don't know as much as most people know about politics. I'm a football coach. I probably don't know as much as most people do about Congress. I'm a congressman, but I'm a football coach. He said, but I got to tell you something. He said, if I were still a football coach, and I were calling the same play for 30 years, and I didn't pick up a yard, I changed the play. We have to change the play. 30 years. The only thing the Democrats and Republicans have really done well together is we've both screwed up on energy efficiency and renewable energy for 30 years. Now, we've changed the play. We're going through a transformation. We passed the Economic Recovery and Reinvestment Act. $90 billion. $90 billion in energy titles. $20 billion on the tax side, $70 billion on loan guarantees, cash disbursements, grants, et cetera. Let me put that in perspective. The budget for the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy last year was $1.2 billion, and $90 billion in the Economic Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Second transformation, we're about to pass a climate change bill. I think we're going to pass it. We still don't know whether we have the votes. I was with Speaker Pelosi in New York City last Friday night. There was a small dinner for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. She said, you know, Steve, I'm thinking about putting the climate change bill on the calendar next week. I said, Madam Speaker, do we have the votes to pass the climate change bill next week? She said, there's only one way to find out. I'm thinking of putting the climate change bill on the calendar next week. And we'll see. We may be here tomorrow, may be here Saturday. We don't really know. But let me tell you one thing I'm really excited about in this bill, and then I'll leave you alone. I have made the argument, and Kateri and I have agreed fundamentally on this, that the three most important letters in our energy policy is not the DOE and not EPA, but ROI, return on investment. Nothing's more important than that. Until we can find ways to incentivize AT&T and Coca-Cola and other companies to make that transformation in their buildings. And they're doing extraordinary things. But they're doing it without the full faith and credit of the federal government. So until we can become partners with them in making sure that they can recoup their investment, make sure that those transformations on deploying energy efficient vehicles and making their buildings more energy efficient and weatherizing and insulating, until we can make that more profitable for them, we're going to go another 30 years on this debate. And so we've done one thing very, very smart in this climate change bill, and I hope you don't mind if I take credit for it.
You should.
Thank you.
You can.
When I go home to my district in New York, look, I don't know about you all, but I'll tell you, New Yorkers, not the most patient people on earth. So when I say to them, we're going to pass a climate change bill, and by the year 2025, we're going to reduce carbon emissions, and the world will be a safer place. These are New Yorkers. They go, I don't care about the year 2025, Mr. Israel. What do I get now? We're New Yorkers. What am I getting today? And so here's what we've done in the climate change bill. We've inserted a provision called PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy Bonds. Here's what I mean. Mrs. D'Amico in Deer Park, New York, she would love to insulate her home. She would love to weatherize her home. She would love to buy new windows. So would lots of commercial property owners in my district, sprawling corporate buildings. They would love to do those things. They can't afford it. Mrs. D'Amico goes to the Home Depot and she says, I'd like to put solar panels on my roof. I'd like to buy new windows. They say, that's fine, Mrs. D'Amico. You pay $30,000, $40,000, but don't worry, you'll get it back in 10, 12 years. And Mrs. D'Amico says, I'm not waiting 10, 12 years. And so we've created something new, Property Assessed Climate Energy Bonds. Here's what it means. Mrs. D'Amico, any town or any county in America can say to Mrs. D'Amico or Coca-Cola or AT&T or any other company, we will go out into the bond market, we'll buy bonds, we will finance those improvements for you. The federal government or the state and local governments will finance those improvements for you. We will modestly increase your property tax assessment to pay us back over up to 20 years. Your utility bills are going to come down through greater efficiencies, and that's going to offset the small assessment in your property taxes, and at some point within a few years, the two will crisscross. You're going to be making money on the deal. And this is going to work because we've inserted language that will require the Department of Energy to provide 100% guarantees for those bonds. So the cost of borrowing will be very low, will be very modest, based on the full faith and credit of the United States government, the Department of Treasury. It will incentivize municipalities to go into the markets. It will incentivize companies to take advantage of those that financing, and Mrs. D'Amico too. Those are the kinds of game changers that we are on the verge of accomplishing. I have another game changer that I have to accomplish now and go to the Energy and Water Subcommittee to do a markup, which I think is going to be very, very generous on energy efficiency and renewable energy. And I thank you for being a partner in that endeavor. Thank you all very much. God bless.